Well, good morning if you're west, and good afternoon if you're east. Welcome to the latest edition of On Track Live. Appreciate everybody taking time out of their schedule to join us today. As a reminder, we always record these sessions and have these available for playback. We're finding a lot more people are taking advantage of that opportunity. So if you ever do miss, you can get a hold of us. I think we may even be posting these on the website and the members only website. So you can go back and review these more like a podcast if you prefer. But appreciate everybody taking the time to listen in. We took last month off for our spring and O&M conferences, which were held in Chattanooga. They were very successful. Those of you who showed up, it was some great speakers and a good chance for folks to get together. Nice meeting. We'll go back to the monthly schedule for On Track Lives now. Our guest next month will be Dave Carnegie from the Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration, SMEs. Got a number of things going, but I also want to talk with Dave about succession planning. They've been doing a lot to deal with the issues that natural resources industries are facing with the graying of the workforce. Not that you can tell, and folks retiring out. So we'll talk some about that next week, and we'll publish some other speakers moving forward. A little shameless self-promotion before we get started today. Want to remind everybody, especially NCTA members, that the NCTA Scholarship Program is open and accepting applications now. Get a hold of me or Melinda if you need some background. There's been some links published in the On Track newsletter. Get the word out inside your companies. This scholarship is open to the families of anybody who works for an NCTA company. It doesn't have to be folks who come to our meetings. And we've got some posters and some letters you can send to your HR departments to get the word out inside your companies. We give scholarships for both college and vocational education. And we have a very loose interpretation of you don't need to be going to work for a coal mine after you graduate for this thing. If you're doing anything that supports a coal community, we've had folks interested in public policy. We've had folks interested in nursing, all the kind of education that would support a coal community as qualifies for the scholarships. So please get the word out in your companies. The scholarship deadline is July 31st. So we've still got plenty of time for you to get those posters and letters out to gin up some more support. The other major item on the to-do list is the NCTA fall meeting. That'll be held in Tucson, Arizona, September 9th through 11th. Registration is now open on the NCTA website. There were also links in the last edition of the On Track. We encourage you to get in. This will be our 50th anniversary celebration. So planning a few extra recognitions and events at the meeting. There's some additional sponsorship opportunities. Some very nice swag is going to be given away. You've got an opportunity to get your company's logo on there with the NCTA 50th anniversary. It'll be a real collector's item. We'll be doing a gala celebration dinner all together while we're there in Tucson. It's at a lovely venue, the Hacienda del Sol. Historic venue. We'll be golfing at Lowe's Ventana, so it's shaping up to be a great meeting in the fall with our 50th anniversary in September. So register early, get a hold of Melinda, line up your sponsorships. Appreciate everybody's support for that. Just a little bit of a news update on the transportation front. Our guest speaker today is more energy and environment, but just a quick update on latest news items. Since we last held one of these, Marty Oberman has retired from the chairmanship at the Surface Transportation Board. Robert Primus has been appointed the new chairman, at least for now, until we see what happens with the next election. So we've now got a 4-member STB, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Whether they can get anything done, we'll see. There's rumblings about who may be appointed for the 5th seat, but frankly, in an election year, it's unlikely that seat's going to get filled. So I think we're probably looking at a 4-member STB for the foreseeable future here. Also on the transportation front, you've seen the railroads tend to be running a little better right now. Folks can debate on how much that is attributable to their efforts to recover from the great meltdown of 21, 22. They are pretty much recovered. They've been taking steps to hire people, but they've also seen a reduction in traffic demand, which has also helped them dig out of the hole. Coal shipments have been particularly low lately, as the utilities have been able to rebuild their stockpiles, and the demand on the coal burn has been lower too. So at the moment, things are moving smoothly. The question is whether, if there is a rebound, if we do have a nice hot summer and the coal starts getting dispatched and other things in the economy improve, will we be able to maintain these levels of service? Emily Regas, our president, is preparing the next round of the NCTA on-time performance survey. That'll be coming out here in the next few weeks in July. We encourage folks to continue to respond to that survey, even when service is good. We tend to get higher response rates when things are bad because people like to complain about it, but please respond even if you're getting good service now. We need that information for benchmarking and developing trends. And Emily's also working on a few additional new questions for the next round of the survey that have to do with some other issues that affect coal shippers related to communication with the railroads and how other things are going. So please, those of you who respond to those surveys, watch your inbox. That'll be coming out in the next few weeks here, and we'd appreciate another robust response. That on-time performance survey has become a key piece of discussions before the STB and before some other policymaker audiences, and we want you to know that the time you take to fill out that survey is very much appreciated. So with that in mind, I've flapped my gums enough. That's our little news update. I'd like to introduce our guest this month. Our guest is Curtis Wilkerson. Curtis is president over at Orion Strategies. Orion is a well-connected public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. that also does a lot of work in the States. They've got offices in D.C. and West Virginia, and I think a couple of other places. Have deep experience in the fossil fuel industry. Some work with coal, and then a lot of work with oil and gas also that informs a lot of the things that are going on in our universe now. And I appreciate Curtis taking the time out of his schedule to chat a little energy and environment, landscape and politics today. Just to kick it off, Curtis, one of the reasons I thought to invite you to join us is you're a regular fixture at the CERA Week down in Houston. CERA. A lot of folks in our audience probably aren't even aware it exists, but this meeting happens annually. And it's kind of the energy industry nerd prom, if you will. The folks who talk about energy and make a bunch of these policy decisions we see rolling out of Washington. This is where the great minds go to dream that stuff up. So maybe we could start there, Curtis. Could you tell us a little more about what CERA Week's like and what the experience is there?
Yeah, and thanks for asking me to do this. It is a CERA Week is in Houston. It's held every spring. The group from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Jurgen, who started all that kind of stuff years ago, has become the preeminent place for the energy community to get together. CNBC is broadcasted from there. Every energy industry publication, I was going to say RAG because that's what we call them, is all there with all these energy reporters. The CEOs of major energy companies, and that's a wide variety. I'm not just talking about oil and gas, but also coal panels, renewable panels, discussions about energy usage, data centers, transmission issues, and then you have the Bill Gates of the world who show up in order to talk about the nuclear stuff with the new developments that are there. But it's one of those things that it's fascinating to get thousands of people together in one place for 1 week, and there's just one panel after another. It's not a cheap for a conference to go to either. It's one of those, I believe, just attending is around $7,500 to for the registration, and that doesn't even get into any type of sponsorship or what have you, or travel, et cetera. And so it's one of the reasons we like to go is because people are not just there, but it's about a learning experience. It's about finding the best and brightest in the energy world all in one place, having these deep conversations. And it's not just the United States perspective. There's people from around the globe. You have energy ministers from Germany and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and so forth who are there. The Secretary of Energy is always a fixture at this event. You have, again, CEOs who are there talking about not just their new cool things, but also the like bread and butter of what they're into. So it's a fascinating event, but also then there's the side conversations that happen that really enlighten different things for those, meeting someone for coffee or a dinner or whatever in order to make sure you're following through with, what do we learn today about this particular development and how that's going to play into the energy sector over the next 20 years type of thing.
So I mean, this year's event happened a couple of months ago. I mean, were there any surprises? What were the major areas of focus and the takeaways this year?
It was IRA sophomore year is what it was. And it was just, the year before it was all like, oh my God, what's happened with the IRA was 2023. People were still trying to figure it out.
IRA being the Inflation Reduction Act that puts $1 trillion worth of government funding out there for various energy type things.
Exactly. And so this year was more of a, all right, we know what's in the IRA. We know what Treasury's starting to do with the tax credits. It was longer, more in-depth conversations about what Treasury was doing correct and incorrect in the eyes of the industry, and what the ripple effects of that was going to be, but also production tax credits, both not just renewable stuff, but hydrogen space became very prevalent during this year's CERA week. Excuse me, I'm getting over some stuff here. But what I was going to add is that, at every conversation for every CEO, they were weaving in what the new energy economy looked like, because there's a significant shift in where taxes are going to be with energy projects, incentives are going to be, but not just about like lofty goals. It was realistic reset of this is now part of our formula in our decision-making process going forward, beyond ESG targets, beyond grandiose statements of net neutrality. It was, here's the pathway we're actually taking. Whether we hit our original goals or not is less significant, and more significant is predictability. And so that was one of the really key things that we saw throughout all of CERA Week this year.
So we've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which is what, almost 3 years old now. That was $1 trillion. The year before that, we had the infrastructure bill that had, and that's another $1 trillion, had a lot of energy related stuff in it. So $2 trillion of government funding out there through direct appropriations and tax credits and all sorts of different things. But it takes a lot of time to spend to figure out how you're going to spend $2 trillion and then spend it. And I think one of the figures I saw was that we've only spent 30% of the infrastructure bill and 17% of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act now. What's your view, Curtis, on, I mean, is that money going to start to flow faster now? And what are the potential implications if the Republicans win back the White House in November? Are they going to try to reel this stuff in?
Yeah, that's a great two-part question. So the first part is that I think passage of the IRA happened and IIJA, and people were like, okay, we're ready, let's roll. And because they knew roughly what was in it, and what we didn't count on was the speed of government. And Treasury in particular took forever to map out, and still has not figured out all the tax credits. Some of these they now have proposed rules on, and they still don't have final tax rules. Well, markets can't make projections for their financials if they don't have some finality on that. So I'll give you a perfect example, which is 45Q tax rules. And so you talk about for carbon sequestration, there's certain rules that Treasury has been looking at that has created some angst in the industry because they are trying to figure out whether a single taxable entity can claim the credit or it can be more than one. So if you've got a power plant that is burning fossil fuels and is putting the emissions reduction on it for an amine solution or what have you, they need to recuperate tax credits to pay for the emissions control. But the people taking away the CO2 via pipeline and then sequestering it in pore space also need tax credit. Well, if Treasury says, no, you can't both claim it, or you can't split it, that becomes a real question of a financial interaction between the two entities that then has to be figured out with legal and accounting and all those things. So that delay is creating, I'm not going to say angst, but it's irritation within the industry. And then to your second part of that question is that you get past November, and then the markets are going to figure out, they're not going to wait till January when the next president's sworn in. When November happens, they're going to adjust based upon who wins the election and kind of figure out what's going to be happening. They've all kind of taken a look at this, and the consensus within the industry is the IRA will survive. The question is whether or not it gets battered around on the outside for political and victories that, let's say that President Trump retakes the White House, that there's Republican Congress. 80% of those IRA projects are in Republican districts. And so there's a lot of value in retaining those projects, and those tax credits that go with them. But you can still beat them up around the edges and say we repeal parts of it and so forth. And the question is how much and where. Excuse me. So I think one of the things that we're going to be paying attention to is just how much that law gets blamed for certain things in the discourse leading up to the election. I'm pretty sure that we don't even have to wait till November. We can take a look at the political ads in September and early October, and we'll already know if the pathway looks like it's going to happen that way. And if not, then I think there will be some Pyrrhic victories at the end of repealing certain pieces that nobody was a fan of or that certain interests weren't fans of. But I think the bulk of the IRA is going to stay intact just because of the geography of the projects.
You mentioned the role that IRS plays and IRS on tax credits and the other agencies, EPA, DOE, and others as it pertains to, funded programs. It's one thing for Congress to appropriate $1 trillion, but then it goes to these agencies to figure out the rules for what it takes to qualify. Yeah. As you've watched those, let's stick with IRS for a minute, as they've now started to come out with the guidance on this stuff, on the continuum of, what the industry would really like to see, presumably some fairly loose guidelines for qualifying to, what in purist enviros might want to see. Where is IRS coming down on that continuum with the guidance that is coming out?
Well, if we're doing this, it's like that, like it's playing off the grid a little bit. And let me be clear. It's fascinating to me that there are very strange bedfellows in this particular discussion, because not only do you have U.S. Chamber and API and others who want to say, all right, let's have the rules as good guidance as opposed to very focal. But there's actually some environmental groups who also want that kind of broad perspective on it. Not all of them. There's some who want it really, really tight, that have come out very much in favor of what is the fastest way to let market forces, in their mind, reduce carbon via the tax code. And so, but the problem that comes onto it is the individuals who are now, through the Biden administration at Treasury and other places, are much more purist, to use that word. It's in restrictive. When we talk about the credits for hydrogen production for those PTCs and the real-time, real location use, as opposed to other possibilities with virtual PPAs on the electrolyzers and so forth, this is becoming a real issue that the industry is beginning to freak out about. And there's a split even within the industry, in the hydrogen industry, amongst individuals who are like, they want it as loose as possible, and others are like, no, we want it tight, and it becomes about what the market advantage of a particular company is and whether or not they can help exclude their competition. And so we're seeing a lack of consistency even within the industry based upon that alone.
Interesting. Where are the carbon capture people in all of this? Are they pretty together, or is there controversy around 45Q as well?
Well, that's a great question because you have the Carbon Capture Coalition and some others who represent a core of CCS folks. But the flip of it is that there's a huge array of other companies who are now suddenly, and not to knock them, but they are in the carbon capture business, which they've never been in before. And they all have different technologies that they swear will work, but have not been tested at large scale. And so there's voices of who, unlike other parts of the energy industry that have long histories of who the voices are, carbon sequestration is one of those that the average policymaker doesn't know who the players are and aren't completely comparative to other industries. And so there's all these individuals who claim they're part of that industry who really are not. So we have folks who are looking to, it's pore space issues that are all over the place. They get into it because what they have found, or what we found is beyond the IRS issues and so forth, we have different opinions based upon the companies at a state level of what's going to be defined as pore space. The ability to pool, the concepts of who has primacy of injection below and above certain strata, what the responsibility of orphan wells on the location are that could allow leaks through caprock, et cetera. Who's going to be responsible for the geology of the area, and what's driving me crazy about this, and this is just me speaking, is that there are companies out there who are saying, no, we do carbon sequestration, none of that's a problem. And all of a sudden you have policymakers at state and local levels who say it's fine. What's the problem? And so that becomes really this undertow of what's happening. And people were just, well, I'll put it this way. The head of American Clean Power, Jason Grummett, said something at CERAWeek that really got my attention. And he repeated it at the American Electric Power Supply Association. He said that he keeps running into a problem where certain Republicans don't understand science and certain Democrats don't understand math. And between the two, it's driving them crazy, and he's like, you got to do both. And so, there are people who don't believe you can, sequester carbon and do it all. But those who do think you can do it in an unlimited manner and it's not a problem whatsoever and it's economic, and like there's economics and math involved too. And like it is, and you talk about volumes, and one of the other pieces that gets lost in all this is that the return rate for even 45Q to work, whether it's for enhanced oil recovery or just permanent sequestration, you have to have a certain minimum volume to pay for everything. And there are any number of facilities in this country that alone will never get there. They're going to have to pull it all together. Then it gets into the same question of splitting the tax credits and who's doing what and how it gets into it. What I think will end up shaking out is that there are going to be companies who are going to say, we're going to buy your CO2, or we're going to take it from you in order to help you meet your internal ESG goals. And we're going to have to take the credit and figure out a financial arrangement later, because then that places all the risk on that group as well. And they're going to have to figure out not only how to work it with IRS, but how to work it on a state level in order to get it where it needs to go. The other part that's important for that, I talk with my thumb, it's giving me a thumbs up, is that you end up with pipeline issues. And pipelines are not easy to build in this country, and it's getting worse. And permitting reform is a whole other conversation. And we can square everything away with IRS. We can square everything away with pore space rights and pooling and other issues for injection into the right formations. And if we can't build pipelines to carry the CO2, it doesn't matter anyway.
That's a great point. I neglected to say at the outset here, this doesn't need to be a conversation just between me and Curtis. If anybody has questions, I'm keeping an eye on the chat box. Feel free to type a question into the chat box and we'll get it into the conversation, or do the raise your handy thingy or unmute yourself and shout something. But if you have questions you'd like to ask of Curtis or enter the conversation, please let us know. Curtis, you mentioned that issue about permitting, and you're a West Virginia guy, so Joe Manchin. I recall I was in a meeting at the Greenbrier 3 weeks prior to the Inflation Reduction Act getting going, where everybody thought Senator Manchin was going to prevent bad law from happening, and then 3 weeks later he kind of sold him up the river by getting the IRA done. And when he did that, Senator Manchin said, "Well, I know we didn't get the permitting part of the IRA worked out, but that's the next thing we're going to do. I have assurances from the administration that we're now going to also advance permitting reform." I mean, where are we on permitting reform?
Well, that's a great question. It's somewhere between stuck in the mud and at full throttle. And I'm not trying to be flippant when I say that. When I've talked to the senator, he believes that there's a deal to be done. He believes that he and Senator Barrasso are roughly on the same page with everything, and that their staffs have been working out details. But then it becomes a larger question as to whether or not anybody wants to have a political fight or a political victory that can be given to anybody prior to the election. Knowing the senator, and I'm not going to suggest we're best friends, but we've known each other for 25 years. He has positioned himself often in the middle as a deal maker. He wants to have progress. And, the trial balloon in that for him was Mountain Valley Pipeline, and he had to, slide it into another piece of legislation and still had to go before the Supreme Court and all that. But for permitting reform, his perspective is very simple, is that no matter what you do with generation of power, or what you're going to do with carbon, or what you're going to do with any number of things, you have to move electrons, or you have to move molecules, or you have to move product. And if you don't have pathways to do that because of permitting, that's where the pinch points are. The lawsuits have been happening, especially from the environmental community, now for over the last couple of decades. And the review process in the United States is abhorrent. It just is. It's absolutely ridiculous. But to answer your question is, I believe the senator, as chairman of ENR, genuinely believes there's a pathway out. The question is going to be whether or not there's the fortitude to get a deal done on the Senate side. But then there's a larger question. Let's say it gets done on the Senate side. What happens when it goes to the House? And then that becomes a whole other situation. So my guess is, they got through 3 FERC commissioners the other day in various levels of support. But when it comes to permitting reform, it does match the values of both sides of the aisle in multiple reasons. I cannot see it being a standalone bill, though. I think it's going to be attached to something much larger. And for that to happen, it must pass by the end of the year. But I think ENR is wanting to move it out of their purview and get it on the floor somehow.
Does it require congressional action, or are there things that an administration could do through executive action? And in that case, how would a Biden versus Trump? There's a 3-part question for you. I'll boil it down to 2. Assuming Congress can't get anything done, how much could the executive branch do, and what would a Biden administration versus a Trump administration view in that regard?
Yeah. And so you get into the difference between, what they can do versus what they're willing to do. For 3 years, 4 years, the Biden administration has been saying that they needed immigration reform. They couldn't do anything without Congress. They come to almost a conclusion. It all stops in its tracks. The White House points at former president and Republican Congress and says, "Oh, look, there's nothing to be done." And then they turn around and write an executive order that does everything they said that they wanted the law to pass. And the American people are going, I'm sorry, you could have done that 4 years ago. What just happened? And so when it comes to permitting reform, I think what's very much in the same boat is that White House keeps wanting to talk about kicking the can back to Congress and abdicating their abilities in order how to enforce certain things under NEPA. So I do believe that there's executive orders that could come out of the Biden White House that they can move at least large chunks of what is otherwise in the permitting reform legislation that has been proposed down the field. But I don't know that you can get permanency, which is what a lot of these projects are looking for long-term financing. And so that's why Congress acting on it is essential, because otherwise you're going to have large banks who are going to say, I just don't need it kicked back and forth, especially over what period of time it takes to build a project. So even if you can get a project greenlit, go through environmental, done in 24 to 36 months, and then it takes 2 to 4 years to build, depending on what it is, you're talking about 7, 8 years out, and you got to have predictability beyond not just one administration, but 2 or 3. And that means changing the law.
Right. Steve Hooks, I've seen your questions and I'm going to work them in, but before we transition that way, we had Bruce Mehlman on here a couple of months ago, and he does great slide decks that, which way the political winds are blowing. And one of the things that Bruce always emphasizes is how every election now is a change election. I mean, you look back at both the general elections and the midterm cycles. We look back the last 15 years, and every single one of these elections has resulted in a flip of one or both of the houses of Congress or the White House. And so change elections are becoming a real thing. Curtis, you mentioned the fact that the business world needs certainty on these policies. If some of these things get done under executive action by Biden or Trump, is the business world really going to believe it, or are they going to be feeling like, well, I'm just at risk when the White House flips back again in 4 years, that I'm now stranded out here?
Yeah, and there's 2 parts to the answer. One is agreed with that perspective. The second is it's also one of the reasons that so many industry efforts, and I'm not just talking about energy, but other spaces as well, have really worked to stop all action at a federal level. The less action, the better. And then they want to go take care of it on state by state level. Now, of course, the flip of that is you got to go through interstate commerce issues, pipelines, transmission lines, et cetera. But for interstate, intrastate issues and projects, they would much rather do it on a state by state level. The flip of that, though, is that without that consistency and that constant understanding of where things are going to be, it's just easier to shut it all down. And I think one of the things that we've seen in this Congress in particular, and I don't necessarily blame just House leadership and where this is going, or Senate leadership, but there's been almost no legislation actually passed this Congress. I mean, people may not love what legislation got passed in the last Congress, but a lot got passed, and it was by brute force, one party control. Like, there was a lot of that. But what we've seen is people purposely trying to slow down the gears of government, not just to get it past this administration, not just to get it past this Congress, but to have predictability about where they're going to fight their battles at a state level.
Right, exactly. One of the questions from Steve gets back to an interesting issue on permitting reform and a lot of other things. The Chevron deference principle is now before the United States Supreme Court. Just for background, Chevron, named for a court case that involved the oil company decades ago, is an established principle in law that says, when Congress passes a law and the agencies go to implement that law, obviously every regulation that gets passed goes to litigation. And so when those rules are now being litigated under the Chevron doctrine, the courts would give deference to the experts, the government experts at the agencies, on any issues where Congress's intent may not be totally clear. And so that's kind of how the world has worked for the last 20, almost 30 years. Let's take a coal ash rule as an example. Congress passed some stuff that was very broad, turned it over to the agency promulgates regulations, the industry sues and says you're overreaching. Under Chevron, the courts would go, well, no, Congress didn't get down to that level of detail, and the experts live in the agency, they have to think. Well, there have been a couple of court cases that have chipped around that Chevron deference principle, but now there's a really big one that's before the court, and we may see a decision, in the next few weeks, that may have the effect of really peeling back that Chevron deference, or maybe even eliminating it entirely. So the question to you, Curtis, is if the Supreme Court does, severely hobble or pull back Chevron, what does that mean for things like permitting reform and other actions that you may want to take?
Yeah, and I'm going to start with two things. One, that's an excellent synopsis of what the Chevron deference is, and the second thing is that I'm not an attorney. So when I say the following, it's in that perspective.
But he plays one on TV, folks.
Exactly,
So
or at least on Zoom. Yeah. So, but one of the core concepts of contract law is that whoever does not write the contract is given the benefit of the doubt. So, and because it creates unfair advantage within the contractual relationship. That runs counter to the Chevron rule or the Chevron deference, because the entity being regulated did not write the rule, and therefore the deference of the contractual relationship between the regulated and the regulator falls currently to the regulator who is writing the contract and the rules and so forth. And so you have two different philosophies of law that kind of are at odds there. And so, a lot of Supreme Court prognosticators have already said they anticipate a pullback of the Chevron deference because of that in this term. One of the things that I think that's going to come of that is that, if that occurs, that there's going to be a big push by industry in the next administration, should it change, to start recutting the rules, because not just on permitting reform, but across the board. It's about what the expectations are going to be for the industry and where they want to go with things. But what it does allow is minor may not be maybe the wrong word, but it allows for opportunities for differences in the way the permitting is enforced or regulated, especially on NEPA, that could create opportunities for industry to expand. And only then do I think that you have that opportunity. If they keep the Chevron deference in place, I don't think there's going to be that much movement.
Good answer. Thank you for that. I wanted to get to this is a bit of an aside or a bit of a step back, but I wanted to get to Steve's other question before we left. If you were looking for, Curtis, if you were looking for a good basic primer to use to get up to speed on the Inflation Reduction Act and 45Q carbon sequestration, where would you send somebody to get educated on that sort of thing? One of the trade groups, or is there a publication out there, or where?
The Chronicles of Narnia is, but yeah, there's API has some great stuff on it. They really do, on their website.
American Petroleum Institute.
Yeah. And so, and that's because they had real interest in it. API has already come out and said that no matter what attempts are going to be made to roll it back, they will help defend it because their members are all over it. So I just want to emphasize that they and U.S. Chamber are both in that boat. But what I would say is that the concepts of not just 45Q, but 45V, 48C, and a whole bunch of other, number letter combinations that give people flashbacks of high school algebra are very much in a situation where there's a tutorial that API has that's a real value there.
Great. Thank you for that lead, Curtis. We've been spending most of our time talking deep sausage making here. I wonder if we could switch gears just a little bit and ask you what's your opinion on not just regulatory policy, but on the ground. What's the current state of the energy transition? I mean, are we really making progress, or is some of the idealism giving away to realities of building things now, or kind of where are we in that, in your opinion?
Yeah, Um, it's a mixed bag. There are any number of advocates for especially renewable energy or what they consider greener energy that are frustrated because it's not a straight line, and it never is, right? Anytime you have a shift in industry based upon technology, it kind of, goes up and down on a continuous progress. Renewable energy now makes up 4.5% of the electric grid in the United States and is going to be the fastest growing forward addition on the grid going forward over the next decade, flat out. But they have nowhere to go but up. So let's start there. Like, it's not like it's taking over the grid tomorrow. Something like 42 or 43% of the grid right now is natural gas. And what people are missing is they think it's about one pie when they're forgetting that the pie is going to get larger. For the last 10, 15 years, the amount of electricity in the United States on a per person use basis hasn't skyrocketed because we've gotten more efficient with our electricity, LED light bulbs, heat pumps, like going down the list. The next 10 years are going to be different. The next 10 years are adding massive data centers. We're going to be adding huge amounts of energy using items in individual houses, businesses, and transportation as well. So as much as people want to make fun of electric cars, it's the fastest growing market as well. So like, we can have a conversation about the fact that it's leveled off in certain areas, but others are also hybrid as well. So you've got a plug-in hybrid. It's essentially an electric car at the same time. And when you see Teslas going around rural counties in America, which we do now, it's hugely different than a few years ago. So the reason I bring that up is because as the pie gets larger and the demand on electricity gets larger, there's a few things that we're going to see. First of all, coal will become less of the pie, but it's still a huge amount. Even if we get 12, 15 years from now, instead of being 17, 18% of total output or what have you, and it goes down to 10, if the pie as a whole has gotten significantly larger, it's still making up a lot of electricity. Natural gas is still going to produce 38, 40% of it. And the growth that's going to be happening in renewables is going to be picking up market share, but it's also about the market just getting larger. So yes, the energy transition is happening, but this idea that natural gas and coal are going away is fiction. It's just not possible. Now, can you match it with enough carbon sequestrations, offsets, and a whole other bunch of conversations? That's a whole other thing. This gets into the difference between those who believe in science versus those who believe in math, right? It just mathematically, you can't replace that many electrons with just with the energy transition. With all that said, what we're also seeing is a cultural blowback that's happening on this. Earlier in the conversation, I mentioned that something like 80% of new energy projects are being built in historically conservative Republican voting districts. Well, if you're putting in a solar array and a local county commissioner is of the belief that every solar panel was personally blessed by Nancy Pelosi, that becomes a problem. It just becomes a fight that's happening. What's being missed of that is a misunderstanding of the production of it. And politics aside, independent power producers make two things: electrons and money. It is not a crusade. They are in the energy business, and people want to ignore that second word. It's business. And whether it is wind or solar or hydrogen or CCS project on a natural gas combined cycle, all of them come down to one issue, which is de-risk a project and make money off of it. So what's driving it isn't just the tax credits, it's that there's an overall momentum that's now happening. And what a lot of people are missing is that, 10 years ago, renewables were the most expensive form of electricity in a total life cycle of a project. And now they're the cheapest. Over the life cycle of a project, cost all in, you end up with sun and wind as your power source. At the end of the day, you're going to save money over its 30-year lifespan. And on a kilowatt basis is now the cheapest. Well, utilities are looking at that too. They're not stupid. They realize they can charge X, and if they only have to pay Y, that gap is a profit line that they can make that otherwise would be lost. And so you guys have seen these numbers, but EIA has been pointing this week in certain RTOs that Certain coal fleets are now at their lowest output in 23 years, which is a significant situation on a per plant basis. But they're still running. You know, there's still a base load that they're hitting. They're still on all the time, but there becomes a cost with that, especially the older they get. And that's the other part that I think at the end of the day is really going to have an effect on the so-called energy transition more than anything is um, aged fleets by far. I think that we start seeing very expensive coal-fired units that people don't necessarily want to put the money into because of a cost per kilowatt return. And at some point, they just say, my 1972 F-150 isn't worth keeping on the road. And that's going to be part of the conversation.
Right. And that's an excellent transition. Next question. Before I ask it, I'll just point out to everybody, we got, about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions you'd like to put to Curtis, please type them in the chat box or something, get them in there now. Yeah, what you just said, Curtis, I mean, this is one of the things that I think about a lot, which is, we keep just dodging some fairly catastrophic large scale power outages in certain grids. If we start having some more of those capacity related power outages in some regions, I mean, is that going to help these aging coal plants come back or stay alive longer, or is the cake already baked because of their age and the environmental regulations that have already made it through the litigation gauntlet? So
we're seeing different responses to that very question, different RTOs. PJM is asking coal-fired power plants in Maryland to stay online, and the state of Maryland's like, we don't want them. Meanwhile, there's looking at, let's say it's like Ohio, and the number of new nat gas power plants coming online there has increased significantly, even though Ohio's at a deficit on its net energy. But then you take a look at places like ERCOT, which, as opposed to saying, yep, we're going to keep tons of coal fleet up, the Texas legislature put up, I think, a $10 billion fund and said, we're going to build a lot more natural gas power plants. And they're doing it all over the place, even in like West Texas and so forth. What they've also done, and ERCOT's different because it doesn't have a marketplace for reliability, but what they put in is performance credit mechanisms so that you have certain redundancies on even the renewables and so forth. So the number one place in the country for batteries right now is Texas. And that's because, and they're running like 4 gigawatts that currently are up or whatever. So there's a situation here where there's going to be the idea of base load is slowly going away. That's an important piece here, whether we're talking coal or nuclear or gas. What we're really talking about is our responsiveness. And so there are certain coal units that will stay up because of what you just said. And it depends on the politics of the state in which they're located. But on an RTO basis, what they're really caring about is the reliability overall. And natural gas units are historically more responsive in certain situations. The real issue that comes into that, though, is that when it's that grid reliability, that reliability isn't needed for 365 days. It's usually needed for 12, 15 days a year. So then the question is, how much do you pay for 12 days of insurance? And then what you're willing to do for that. And people think that that's going to be pumping money into certain base load generation. That's not what the right return. And so I think we're going to have discussions about large battery. I think we're going to have discussions about peakers. I think we're going to have more conversations about small scale nukes in order to do offsets, because those individual grids are going to realize that the cost of 365 days versus 12 days is a very big difference on that. So I think that's where it's going to head.
That's helpful. Thanks, Curtis. I've got, one grand question here to maybe wrap things up, because, I think we probably don't have to discuss much that, in a rapidly evolving election year here, there's probably not a lot more that's going to get done this year. And if current management wins a second term, we can probably be reasonably assured that the next 4 years will look like a lot like the last 4 years.
Yeah.
But the big wild card here in energy and environment is if Trump wins, how much of the Biden energy and environment agenda, and I think the Biden administration should get credit where credit's due. They really pounded out a ton of regulations in a pretty short period of time, to try to get ahead of any Congressional Review Act opportunities and that kind of thing. But let's assume that Trump does win in November. How much of what Biden's been able to get in place in energy and environment is he going to be able to undo, and aligned with that, how high on his to-do list would energy and environment be?
Well, that's the question, right? Because the average human being in the United States cares about inflation and they care about other issues. Energy is really not way up there on the average person's attention span. The other thing really gets into, no matter who's the president, it's going to depend on who is controlling Congress. Right now, it looks like the Senate's going to flip to Republican. The question is whether or not the House retains Republican leadership. Regardless of who retains the House, it will be by the narrowest of margins. It's going to be probably single digits Democratic or single digits Republican, just as it is today. And therefore, you're going to have a few key members of Congress. Let's say that you have a Republican White House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. It's a 5 or 6 vote majority. Suddenly, fewer than a dozen members have complete control of the federal government because they are going to push it. Essentially, they are going to do what Joe Manchin did for 2 years because as they can keep their votes together. I can't stress this part enough. The White House can do any number of things it wants to when it comes to how the administration prioritizes its regulatory abilities. But if there's major shifts in the tax code, which is what's going to happen because the 2017 tax cuts are up in 2025, there's going to be budget reconciliation. Congress is going to be where the fight's going to be. And it is a situation that no matter whether we're talking about permitting reform, or any number of other issues, it's really about tax reform. All the stuff is about taxes. The IRA, I mean, people want to make it about an energy bill. It was a tax bill. And that's because it was budget reconciliation. And by directing where people spend their money with investment or whether they take tax credits in specific markets, that's how we dictate behavior.
I promised that was the last question, but you just stimulated another one. So now we're going to go full political science major geek. You mentioned how the razor thin Republican majority in the House, and for that matter, the Senate's in kind of the same boat, is causing these factions within the parties, to stick together to pull a Manchin. That'll be our new. By using my position in the middle, I leverage what I need to get. So here's the political science major question. Have we functionally ceased to be a two-party system here? And are we now operating more like a parliamentary system like you see all over Europe, where, we may not have a bunch of different names for our political parties, but in order to get anything done, you've got to go latch together a bunch of coalitions?
Yes. Flat out, yes. The amount of control is by, it's no longer by fiat, right? Like it used to be, whoever was majority leader, whoever was the speaker, controlled everything. The Senate majority leader question of who's going to take McConnell's place is right now a fight over how much Jeffersonian versus Madisonian control that the leader will have. There's literally at the Senate leadership luncheon yesterday, Thune, who is McConnell's heir apparent by some standards, was arguing for further democratizing the representation of leader amongst the Senate. And McConnell stood up and said, you don't want that. You want a strong leader who's going to tell you the right thing to do, even if you disagree. What we saw in the House was when they splintered that and took away the power from McCarthy because of how many times and how many ballots it took him to win the speakership, that has continued in those, it empowered the factions even more. If a similar thing happens in the Senate, the very thing that you just described isn't just a blip. It will become part of the political fabric for a couple of decades.
I appreciate that. We're about out of time. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially thank Curtis Wilkerson for joining us and offering his opinions. I'm always amazed when I get really smart people like Curtis to turn out for guys like me, but he's one of the smartest dudes in Washington that I know, and really appreciate your insights here this week. So thank you for taking the time out here, Curtis. And with that, we're gonna end on time. My favorite new in the era of Zoom, we're gonna give you back 3 minutes of your lives here by ending at the 57-minute mark. So appreciate everybody joining, and again, thank you very much, Curtis, for taking the time to be here today. So, and we'll see everybody same bat time, same bat channel next month. Thanks a lot.